Welcome to Altus Insights Podcast series with Ray and Marlon, hosted by me, Avi. This podcast will cover monthly market updates and construction cost impacts across major markets in Canada.
So Ray is away on vacation, so today's podcast has two guest contributors. I know what you're thinking, when does Ray actually do any work? It's a question we've been asking ourselves for a long time, and the conclusion is he does jack all around here. So today we're going to be discussing risk in the current market, especially with the volatility and how you can mitigate that in a development project. We have a returning esteemed guest from the US with Faris, who heads up our advisory team on the London developer side from Pennsylvania, and another guest who's a lot less esteemed, who's joining us from Scotland in an actual pub, is Jack, who heads up our development management team for North America. Actually, usually he lives in Calgary, but today he's in Scotland to watch the powerhouse of world football. I know what you're thinking, Man U, Real Madrid, PSG, Rangers. No, Inverness Thistle. They can be often found playing in front of 700 wild fans, are going to beat Celtic at the weekend in the cup final. And he has a thing for really terrible cocktails, just like our other fake Scotsman, Colin Doran, who was also not born in Scotland. Gents, do you want to do a quick introduction to yourselves? You want to go first, Faris?
Yeah, I'm Faris Rehman. I'm based in US and taking care of development advisory for the group. It's been busy start for me lately, and hopefully looking forward to a robust start towards the end of the year, right to the next year.
You want to go, Jack?
Yeah, hi, Jack McGowan. I'm head of the development management, project management section of Altus. I'm based in Calgary, and I look after project management services across Canada.
So we live in contradictory times. Demand for housing is at an all-time high, but developers across North America are struggling with a constantly changing environment. And that can be from the entitlement approval stage, interest rate increases, supply chain challenges, labor shortages, construction costs, sustainability, climate change. The list is almost endless. So we've got two experts today on risk. We know risk is huge. How are we going to navigate the depths of hell, referring to somewhere like Toronto, the relative paradise that is Texas, or the rain of the West Coast with Seattle and Vancouver, and then the snow of Calgary? So in the chat before the podcast, Jack, you mentioned that you often see 5 key risks that you're always looking at in any development of project. Do you want us to walk us through those?
Sure. The first one, I guess, is risk identification and assessment. So you've got to look at what you're doing and where you're doing it and identify that risk. So you can try then, number 2, to try and mitigate that risk with contingency planning, etc. Then most clients, if you're looking to transfer that risk from themselves to the people who deserve that risk, which is the people who are doing the work, etc. And so then that leads into the risk avoidance. So the client's trying to avoid that risk by passing it on to the people who should be having that risk at the time. And then finally, risk monitoring and control, where you would monitor the risk during the project, and then you would try and control those outcomes and mitigate any risks that do come up.
So if we work on those assumptions, the 5 key risks and the way we go about it, what advice would you give to an individual company or a developer or a person with a development site in terms of first steps to avoid those risks or mitigating? And how would you see the difference between private and public sphere changing that? Faris, you want to go first as we got the introduction from Jack?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jack, for the brief outlook of what we should be expecting in this time that we're living in right now. You very well put on all those major items, but when you go to the nitty-gritties of those, they change from project to project and develop to developer and market to market. Obviously, we are living in, we have this change is such a constant issue right now in every segment of what you just mentioned in terms of those highlighted, like on the larger picture. So right now we're living in this obviously spiking construction costs and the liquidity crunch, which we are facing, and we will be hearing a lot about it too. So financial slow payments obviously could be an issue too down the road. Not right now, but again, these are issues we typically hear and we are hearing right now too. The other side is the operational or the project risk as well. So schedule delays, lack of funding, for example, things of that nature, which is happening too. And then on the larger economic picture, you have your inflation, then you have your escalation, and then likely the recession factor in, which is a talk, but it's a muted discussion, but it's happening as we know. On the legal and contract side, obviously there's a risk factor too. How to mitigate that risk is the next thing. Like how can the developers, contractors, and subcontractors can safeguard their interests basically by having some specific clauses in this change time that we are in right now to safeguard their interests. And then obviously the predictive estimating and any use of robust artificial intelligence per se, and the use of data, how to analyze your internal data and how to predict it in this. And it all depends on the input factors too. And that is the key, in my opinion, in this risk identification per se, which is the biggest thing, that we have to identify the risks on larger scale. And then you can you can narrow down on your project particulars per se. So I'd let Jack add something to that too.
Yeah. So obviously, if you're looking at going into a different area for where you're just still understanding everything about your marketplace, suddenly you've got to consider a number of things like the regulatory framework that you're stepping into, making sure that you understand what you're stepping into and how that is going to affect any product that you're going to be delivering in that market. The environmental considerations, you're going to be pretty certain that if you're moving into a new area, those considerations, whether it's the government regulations that are changing in those environmental considerations, you're going to have to take that into account. Building codes and standards change from province to province, state to state, and also from, if you're moving from Canada to the US or whatever, in those markets, that would be a big consideration that you're going to have to look at. Project financing and procurement is also very different in those different areas. From, say, for instance, from Montreal to Calgary, it is quite a different model in how you're going to fund that and who's going to be in those areas. And also cultural and social factors, because that's going to be quite a different step in different direction in different areas as well.
So you've jumped ahead and answered the next question, not really addressed the actual question, which is, I'm a new developer, I've got a site, say I'm in an area right now, what's the first advice you'd give to mitigate the volatility in the market right now, Jack? So say a client comes to you, says, can you guys help me out? What is it you're telling that new client they need to do when they're looking at a site?
Well, understand the market. I think you've got to understand the market where you're in the new area that you're going into. That's what you're asking. Is it wrong?
Kind of, because you're worried about if you're moving from location regulatory, but if you were to start development today and say you know the market, what do you do to mitigate your risk so you don't get screwed when you get into construction? You're not going to have problems getting through the approval process, because clients can understand the market. Say I'm in Calgary, I know the market, but how do I get that development from an idea in my head and mitigate all of these volatility risks I see and hopefully end up in 5 years with a project that's finished?
Planning, I would imagine. Identification of those risks is critical, as I said before. How you then move that on to getting your project going ahead would be depending on how you mitigate those risks.
Yeah. So, okay, we spoke about moving around. So I'm a developer from the US when it comes to Canada, or I'm a developer that wants to go from Canada heading south. We spoke about some of the regulatory changes, but how hard is it to do that, do you think? And how do you manage the risk of going into that new environment that you completely don't know now? So you know how to do development, you know the whole process, you know how it works. I think we had a discussion about boots on the ground and stuff in the previous discussion. What's the best way to go into a new market and make sure it succeeds in terms of making sure you get your risk covered and you got the right structure in place to get it done?
Certainly. I mean, I can add to that because first of all, like you got to know the market, which you're getting into, and you got to know your product very well too, what you're trying to put up there. As a developer or as a team, that you know your product better than anybody. And obviously you're going to a new market. It might not be the same product or the same requirements for that local market that you're used to. For example, a developer coming from Canada to US would be expecting a lot of factors. First of all, the market is very different here too. As Jack had mentioned earlier, your regulatory environment is very different, and it's very state to state. Climatic conditions per se, coming from Calgary or from there to Florida, for example, or Texas, or you'd be up for a big climate related issues that you might be dealing with, which again translates back into your regulatory environment, your building codes, your local product, how you are trying to position that. So it all depends on your marketing data. So marketing data is the first key, which is very readily available in the US. And that is one of the first stopping point of any developer who comes here, which is your GIS system based, which provides you profiles and trends of the overall market. And then you can focus on your niche product. Let's say if you're going for multifamily, senior living, mixed use, it gives you trends overall on the micro and macro conditions as well. So that is your starting point. You gotta have that information before you go in for any land deal, for example. So typically that we get across people at the land development stage. Obviously, land acquisition is the first stage. That is, and then again, knowing the local people as well. So you have to think locally, but act globally, as we say in our do it at times, particularly when you're a developer working overseas and in US, Canada, or in an international player. So you got to team up with a national firm who has local presences. That's what I tell everybody. That is the key.
And Jack, on Friday, Jack, we had a meeting discussing some of the project management approaches and stuff like that. And one of the things you guys were a huge advocate on the planning side is actually coming up with a project specific plan that addresses the risks, addresses the delivery, and sort of captures some of the stuff Faris said about boots on the ground, knowing the market, doing the data. How do those project plans sort of work in helping you? I got a new development, I've got a plan ahead for it. How would that plan help you create sort of a roadmap that deals with what Faris has said, but also helps them move through a project, knowing where they're going next?
I think just jumping back to your question about moving into different areas as well. One of the successful models that we've seen is when people do go into new markets, they joint venture with someone in that marketplace who can provide that advice. And that's what we see as a very successful model when you see people coming into the Calgary markets. But then the project plans that you're talking about is in consultation with the clients. We go through everything that will affect you on that project with the local knowledge and bring in their knowledge of what their product is so that it can fit the market. Because I mean, every project has to fit the market that you're going into. And if obviously if the client isn't tailoring that for the local market that he's going into, it's going to be a little bit difficult and successful in that model, right?
So on the speculative side, so we're talking about speculative building per se versus building which you will be selling, for example. We have buyers already, so that we see a lot of speculative building as well in the US, particularly. Be it any sector, multifamily, be it warehouses, be it except the healthcare and like a real end user based products. In general, you will see a lot of speculative building, and it works well. But again, there are so many other external factors that can affect those projects when you're speculatively building these. And most developers, as we know, they are speculative builders anyways, right?
Yeah. So we work at Altus. We understand change. Now, implementation and resistance can often get way more complicated than it should do. How important is it to deal with that change and that change management if you're looking at going into new markets and whatnot? Is that going to be a massive challenge, actually changing your whole mindset as a company as you move into a different province, a different state, a different country even?
Yeah, I think that, we're, as Altus, we're actually looking at heading into new markets as well. And, yourself, you've been with Altus a long time. We've looked at this change a number of different times, and sometimes it's been successful and other times it's not. And it comes down to the commitment of the company for that change, making sure that the resources are provided for that change and that the product that you're actually bringing to that new market is actually what fits that market. There's no point, if you're track fishing and there's no point in bringing the wrong fly at the wrong time of year. You need to make sure it's project specific and it's very tailored to what you're trying to do at that time in the marketplace. So you have to be very sure on that.
Jack just outlined some of the challenges it sees with change management. What are your thoughts on those, Faris?
Well, one thing I see in terms of the change management, it all depends. As a starting point, data is the key to all of us. And at Altus, we take pride in that we have large amount of data. Now, it all depends on how we manipulate that data for the benefit of the client and present them the best case scenarios and the worst case scenarios too. So I think going forward, data is becoming central. artificial intelligence and the inputs to the project management and in the feasibility and pre-construction phase, that's becoming more of a profound change that we have to adapt, and it's happening very fast too. As we talk to people, I was recently at a busy place and met a lot of people throughout the country, and this is happening, and we should be bracing that. And companies like Altus I'd say we have a leverage over a lot of other clients in how we can address those clients' issues and provide them with more of a scenario planning per se.
So big data and stuff, everyone likes to talk about that. But in terms of project management, managing risk, development management, how important is experience or boots on the ground versus data? Isn't data just the starting point? You still need that experience and those boots on the ground and that senior advisory process to move through. Supported
Absolutely.
by
Absolutely. So from a development team perspective, like every development team has two major components. Where you have your development team at the beginning, and then you have your construction team, which implements those. So there's the alignment of those teams at the beginning of the job, and how you proceed and team up with the local players and align your project goals with the overall profitability and your risk profiles, et cetera, for the job. And then again, knowing the local market is very important. If, for example, like a project could have significant costs, off-site costs, for example, which may or may not be in anywhere. Utility costs could be huge nowadays too for the sites, for example. Your environmental risk, as Jack had mentioned, and your local regulatory soil conditions could be huge costs as well. So having that information upfront through the local teams and local players who know the market well than anybody and have been working in those markets for a longer time could be of a great input to you to mitigate those risks and see if that project is even feasible or fits your bill at all.
So
I just had a good thought on that though. You were talking about experience though. When we're looking for experienced people in the marketplace, you want someone who gets up in the morning, 80% of what they see in that day, they've seen before. Therefore, whatever challenges they get, that's what clients are looking for, people on the ground, so that if there's anything coming out, we've actually dealt with it before. So it's just a case of bringing that muscle memory back in and making it work for those times. So that's very important.
I have a question, Jack, actually, slightly off topic, though. Obviously, you've worked all over the world to a degree, and you've been in the Middle East. How do you find the approach to risk and whatnot in North America is compared to, say, the Middle East or the other areas you've actually had experience in?
Yeah, it does vary in the different marketplaces. In the Middle East, I guess the government price is a bit different because it's a very long range, 30-year plan where they're developing whole areas and there's a lot of money. So you do find that they're more accepting of risk of building things in the middle of the desert, for instance, as opposed to, say, Calgary in the middle of 2017 to 19 when there was a recession there. People were not developing. It was quite a dry period for development. People thought there's always development going on, but it wasn't as robust as it could have been. So I do think that the model for risk in the Middle East is quite a bit more aggressive than it would be. And maybe the tolerance of whether it makes money or not is less so in the Middle East. They're building. Now, we did a number of different hotels. Of course, they're going to make money, but the scope and size of these buildings is just vast.
So is that a flaw in North America? Because obviously I'd say Canadians are probably the most risk adverse. Our zoning reflects that. Our approach to building reflects that. I would say the US is somewhere in between the Middle East and Canada, and different states have different risk acceptance and different, more entrepreneurial approach. Is it a flaw when we know we have a housing problem in Canada and the US that we are so risk adverse and we have a lack of willingness on both the government side to push private, help mitigate that risk and just get it done?
I think so. I think so. I think that we need to be a little bit braver in building larger projects that really do change the landscape of where we're working. And I get very excited when I've been involved in these really large projects that really make a difference to the area and the city that we're building, as opposed to in Calgary or Edmonton or the prairies like that, where it does seem to be a little bit less exciting, perhaps. I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. But,
No, I think that's fine.
No, I think also we've got a huge housing problem across the country, and yet we still don't seem to be able to make the big decisions that should change that. Let's just spend the money, get the stuff built, and we know that CMHC and the government money hasn't really trickled down to these affordable housing projects, for instance, and we're a little bit above that. There's just not enough housing for people.
And Faris, when you sit down in the US, obviously you mentioned earlier on, there's a lot more speculation in the housing market down in the US. You're not having to get 70% of deposits before you go flying off and stuff, because that's our way of mitigating risk up north. But in the US, do you think it's more entrepreneurial that maybe, Canada could learn a little bit from the US, maybe US could learn a little bit about risk avoidance after the meltdown in 2009, but...
No, I think the issue in the US is mainly the funding in the markets. So the lax the markets are, the more the speculative trends in the construction industry robustness we have seen. And now lately, since the 2018 Dodd-Frank bill, when it was lax for the major banks, so the regional banks picked up, and we saw a lot of building in CRE particularly sector, and that is impacting the overall banking sector, and it's impacting the lending right now, which is again slowing down your construction progress, particularly on the multifamily side, which is more lender finance as well. So it should be a combination. I think when I came in from US side, I saw is like it's a little bit risk takers here.
Yeah.
compared to anywhere, particularly from Canadian perspective, because I work there too. And it's a good thing to do that, but I thought everybody has done their lessons in 2008, and it has been more reasonable and manageable market. However, COVID upturned a lot of that, and we are seeing that the office sector, as we all know, it is under a lot of stress right now, and it is impacting the lending industry in general, and the lending for the new projects in particular, which are developer finance projects. So I'd say housing is an issue across the board here too in the United States. We know we are lagging behind quite a bit on that, and too, affordable housing being a big issue too. Any major market you go, and the cost of this greening of economy is having a big impact, as we all know too, particularly in some market is much severe than others. But we are blessed that way that you can go to South, for example, and continue to grow, and you follow the population trends are in that direction. So construction follows that. So we'll somehow mitigate that. But however, the overall issues across the board, as you're seeing in Canada or anywhere else, are pretty much the same here too.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is to the earlier point, that's why I was asking Jack. I think the Middle East might not have it perfect, but the fact that governments are willing to take risks, I suppose that's a difference in governance as well. That willingness to take risks generates growth that, in essence, in the long run, works out for the good of everybody, even despite the risks. Whereas I find Canada is ultra conservative in terms of taking risks, and then the US, depending which state you're in, tends to be a little bit restricted. And that's why we see these massive challenges in places like California with housing and whatnot. It's that different approach to governance. Whereas if we went out to if you looked at Texas, it would have a much different challenge. And even Calgary and Alberta does, and I would argue Calgary and Alberta and Texas, very similar sort of mindset approach to things. They have a much different issue than you have in, say, Toronto. So, gents, I'd like to thank you for today. You guys, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you, gents, for your contribution today, and look forward to talking to you guys again soon.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay.